morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do. Big show today. So Putin and Trump are going to be meeting in Alaska. Might we get a Ukraine peace deal? We will break all of that down for you and what the indications are. Also, we're going to dig into some social trends. I don't know if you guys saw these viral charts. Social scientists are sounding the alarm over some significant personality changes, especially among younger generations. So we will try to figure out what is going on there. Israel assassinated a well-known Al Jazeera journalist and his entire crew. We're going to have an editor over at Drop Site News who knew him well join us to talk about his life, his legacy, and also Israel's just relentless murdering of journalists and the silence from the West as that has been ongoing. We're going to dig into some wild comments made by ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt, including some on intermarriage. Quite a hot take there. Some big updates on the Israel First movement here in the United States, and investigative journalist Seth Harp is going to join us to discuss his new book, The Fort Bragg Cartel. I do not think you want to miss that particular topic. We're also going to be doing our AMA Live today for premium subscribers. So if you want to take part in those going forward, make sure you sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Thank you to everybody who has been doing that. You can support the show, breakingpoints.com, monthly or yearly memberships. We're always looking out for benefits and for the customer experience. But if you can't afford it, no worries. Just please, if you're watching this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on a podcast, leave a 5-star review, and then more importantly, send an episode that you really like to your to a friend, to a family member. It really helps us grow. It's not $1 in marketing ever spent on this show, and yet it continues to grow. So thank you to everybody. As Krystal said, we're going to start with the Ukraine-Trump summit, or Trump-Russia summit. Ukraine is still a questionable one. It will take place on Friday in Alaska. A lot going on here behind the scenes. Here is Trump now talking about it in the Oval Office. Here's what he had to say.
President Zelenskyy has to get all of his everything he needs, because he's going to have to get ready to sign something, and I think he is working hard to get that done.
Will Zelenskyy have to give up territory, Mr. President?
Well, you're looking at territory that's been fought over for 3.5 years with, a lot of Russians have died, a lot of Ukrainians have died. So we're looking at that, but we're actually looking to get some back. And some swapping. It's complicated. It's actually nothing easy. It's very complicated, but we're going to get some back. We're going to get some switched. There'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both. And but we'll be talking about that either later or tomorrow or whatever.
Pay very close attention to what he said there about the swapping of territories. That is going to be the crux of this entire summit and whether or not it is successful or not. Let's go and put this AP story up on the screen. Trump says he will meet Putin next Friday in Alaska to discuss the end of the Ukraine war. It remains up in the air whether President Zelenskyy will attend. Originally, they had floated a summit which was bilateral between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and then trilateral, including the Ukrainians. However, the Ukrainians are making quite a bit of noise now afterwards and drawing some red lines of their own in the sand. This entire idea of swapping territory is the one which the Russians are going to have the most trouble with, Krystal. By the way, the way that this has all come about is so preposterous that, look, I mean, I generally am more supportive of Witkoff, I think, than most other members of the administration, but this is part of the problem with having a guy who's doing Gaza and in Ukraine, and also previous qualifications for building the Fontainebleau Hotel in Las Vegas, is basically he met with Putin. Putin was like, sure, yeah, let's end the war. I'll have a ceasefire. And that will entail basically freezing things where they are. Witkoff thought that to mean that he would be open to not just a ceasefire, but potentially giving up some territory. Putin in his comments have been like, no, that's not what we're doing. Right. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are like, hold on a second, we can have a ceasefire. By the way, Ukrainian law says that we need to have a national referendum on whether any of that's going to happen. Remember, the entire country, plus the delusional Europeans, all still believe that Ukraine needs to be restored to its original borders.
Including Crimea.
Including Crimea. So it's like we are basically nowhere in terms of the conflict. There's been no diplomatic resolution. At the same time, Trump has introduced these secondary sanctions on countries like India, which currently has a 50% tariff. The policy of the United States right now is all over the map. We are both in a more hawkish direction with harder sanctions than Joe Biden ever proposed. The United States is currently shipping just recently some $250 million of offensive weaponry to the Ukrainians, including the shipping of a Patriot battery, which was never open under the Biden administration. And yet at the same time, we're meeting here with Putin. I mean, look, my card's on the table. I want the war to end, but that's going to require some serious compromise from the Ukrainians and the Europeans, which they have not yet been able to make. So right now, things are crazy. They are just totally ambiguous. The summit itself and how it will all come about is one which is indicative of the Trump administration, which is like flitting about basically from policy to policy. We went from berating Zelenskyy in the Oval, saying you don't have the cards, to actually he does have the cards because he's getting most of what he wants.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's that's where we're at right now.
Yeah.
We're meeting with Putin on Friday. We'll see what happens, in Trump's words, because I don't really have anything else of them.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the positive.
Yeah.
It's good they're meeting.
Yeah, it's good. I agree. I agree.
Support it. I support
Listen,
them meeting
they should have met on
US
day
soil.
one.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. The only way you're going to be able to resolve this is through these sorts of meetings. So I will say that is a positive step in the right direction.
I'm with you.
I want to dwell a little bit on what you're saying about Witkoff, because this was a major screw up from him. He appears to have completely misrepresented or misunderstood the Russian position in terms of what they were willing to quote unquote give up, which is basically they're not actually willing, at least from the outset, to give up anything. And so he misstated that, created a lot of confusion, had to walk it back. And, I think it's worth reassessing a lot of the Witkoff hagiography that we got at the beginning of this administration, not just because of this sort of like amateur hour fuck up with a major high stakes negotiation such as this. But we also know at this point that with regard to Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Witkoff has not been part of the solution. At the end of the day, he has been just as much a part of undermining, towing Netanyahu's line and destroying those negotiations with Hamas as Trump himself and as Netanyahu. So I think it's worth us putting to bed the idea that Steve Witkoff was going to be some wild card, great negotiator, going to bring world peace. That has not been the track record that this man has, that we have seen from this man.
Even though originally, there was some promise, but it's like you said, especially with the Gaza, with the way that has all come about, it does raise serious questions here about Russia, the way that Russia, but the problem with the schizophrenia of the Russia policy is that you can basically look into this whatever you want. And I know I'm dwelling on this, but it's very important if you follow the details. So on the one hand, we're shipping weapons and we're taking more hawkish views than Biden. On the other, we're now meeting with Putin. But listen, I agree, I'm all for meeting, but all of the concrete policy has drifted in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
We're shipping weapons, we're doing more sanctions, and we're basically demanding that Russia pull back, from whatever it's Donetsk or whatever province exactly that they want to fully control, along with the two capitals, which they say the Ukrainians need to withdraw from. At the same time, we are not really doing much to quell the European and Ukrainian delusions that all their territory is ever coming back. Every day that the war continues, they lose territory. This is an empirical fact. You can look at the realities of the battlefield on the ground. We could ship them everything that we don't have strapped to the ground that isn't going to start a nuclear war, and they would still lose. They would just lose slower.
Yeah.
And so that's the question of what material interests does the United States have in all of this?
Well, and not only that, so the territory is one piece and one gigantic stumbling block. But then you also have to ask, okay, well, what were the underlying conditions that led to Russia's invasion?
Of course.
And this is, again, not to deny Russia's agency and that they shouldn't have done it and all of those sorts of things. But you also have to understand their perspective and what led to this aggressive action. And, the NATO eastward expansion, the idea that Ukraine could be part of NATO, our efforts to pull Ukraine into a European sphere versus having Ukraine be a neutral party. Those are the underlying conditions that led to this provocative and, yes, illegal action from Russia. So is the Trump administration going to be serious about dealing with those underlying conditions? You also, we talk a lot about, and understandably so, okay, if we made a deal with Putin, can we trust Putin? They have to be asking the same question. Can they trust us?
Of course.
I mean, look at the way our country in general operates, not just under Donald Trump, but look specifically at how Donald Trump operates. There's no reason for them to trust us and our good faith in any negotiations. Just look at how we've acted with, Israel.
With Iran also.
And Iran, exactly. We used the pretext of diplomatic negotiations to launch an offensive, aggressive war against the Iranians. So why would any country in the world, and certainly not an adversarial one like Russia, trust that we're coming to the table in good faith. So when we were talking about how much of a problem that was, that we used the pretext of diplomatic negotiations, it wasn't just about what the fallout would be with regard to Iran. It was also about how will we be able to approach these other high-stakes diplomatic negotiations and have anyone take our word for anything. So that also remains, a major issue going into this tete-a-tete with Trump and Putin.
I said that so much at the time. I was like, does anybody understand what it means to use diplomatic negotiations as a ruse? I was like, by the way, Iran is small ball compared to Russia and to Ukraine. And I don't think that there's any mistake that Putin, at every turn when Trump is like 50 days, he's like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to keep bombing Kyiv.
Yeah.
And then the next day, they're like 12 days. He's like, yeah, okay,
Sure,
I'm just going to keep bombing. He's like, what are you going to do about it? I'm a nuclear armed state with 9,500 nuclear warheads. Go for it. You can put all the, deals or whatever you want on the table. Here's the vice president talking about the issue recently in an interview. Let's take a listen.
Fundamentally, this is something where the president needs to force President Putin and President Zelensky really to sit down to figure out their differences. We have a lot of economic points of leverage, and we're willing to use those to bring about peace. And that was a big thing that happened. To your point about weapons, what we said to the Europeans is simply, first of all, this is in your neck of the woods. This is in your back door. You guys have got to step up and take a bigger role in this thing. We're done with the funding of the Ukraine war business. We want to bring about a peaceful settlement to this thing. We want to stop the killing. But Americans, I think, are sick of continuing to send their money, their tax dollars to this particular conflict. But if the Europeans want to step up and actually buy the weapons from American producers, we're okay with that, but we're not going to fund it ourselves anymore.
Yeah, with great respect, that's the Biden policy, right? I mean, the Biden policy was just U.S. and Europeans. Remember the talking point of like, oh, it's going to be great for the U.S. economy. I'm like, oh, really? The defense dollars, of course, are widely distributed across our economy. So we're dealing with that. We've also got Zelenskyy sounding off here. And look, I understand, it's an emotional thing for the Ukrainians and for a lot of Ukraine supporters here in America, but you need to deal with reality. You're a small country, you're up against a nuclear-armed power. It's a non-NATO nation. There's no obligation for the United States to defend you. And you're drawing lines in the sand, which were ridiculous on the day that the war started and Crimea was already overtaken, and frankly, like delusional in the year 2025. But here's what Zelenskyy had to say in response. He says, quote, Ukraine is ready for final decisions that can bring peace. Any decisions that are against us, any decisions that are without Ukraine, are at the same time decisions against peace. They will not achieve anything. These are stillborn decisions. They are unworkable decisions, and we all need real and genuine peace, peace that the people will respect. Basically saying that anything that Ukraine does not sign off on is one that is completely bunk and will, of course, not stand up. Now, here's the issue, with that, is that the Ukrainian position is one that is, again, it is completely delusional. Let me read here specifically from the Ukrainian and European counter ceasefire proposal. What they say is that in a joint statement from the Europeans, as well from Germany, the UK, and France, is all that any diplomatic end must protect Ukraine and Europe's security interests, but that specifically their ceasefire proposal, quote, crucially, the European plan, which presented to all of the Americans, stipulates that any territorial concession by Kyiv must then be safeguarded by ironclad security guarantees, including, quote, potential NATO membership for Ukraine. And it just doesn't make any sense to give NATO membership for Ukraine in a war that started at least in part because of a NATO invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. I already know, the neocons and all these other people will get very upset about this, but look at the history of it. Ukraine has always been a linchpin of Russia's security strategy. I'm not saying it's legitimate, it just has been. It has been recognized from the beginning of the expansion of NATO by George Kennan, by Bill Burns, who was a previous CIA director under Joe Biden. They all said in writing, they're like, look, even expanding into the Baltics is a problem, but Ukraine must always remain off the table. And then, if we look at the exact moment that U.S.-Russia relations completely flipped on a dime, was when the Munich Security Conference of 2007. That is very around the time that we invite Georgia and Ukraine to enter NATO. And what does Putin do in 2008? Does everybody remember? It was like, Putin at the Beijing Olympics, I think in 2008, while the Russians march into Georgia. And now similarly here with Ukraine, where the Kamala and the Biden administration were making a lot of steps towards actually formalizing Ukraine into NATO. And then lo and behold, we got to find ourselves in a war. Not just justify the war, it's just reality. Yeah. And it's one where, I understand the Ukrainians are like, well, how can we ever, want peace? I'm like, listen, your victory is you get to live. You get to live to fight another. You get to keep 80% of your country. That's a decent deal considering all the amount of money and the amount of lives that everybody has expended. Yes, it's easy for me to say here from Washington, but we're the global superpower. We're the ones at the end of the day who get to decide how the conflict ends. And if you want otherwise, well, get some nuclear weapons. I don't really know what else to say to you.
Yeah.
Zelensky, he's a serious problem.
Yeah, no, he is a problem at this point. I mean, I think he has this Hollywood conception of he's the main character and there's a glorious happy ending in which all the, evil is vanquished and good prevails and he doesn't have to budge a single inch off his position. And, Biden certainly fed into that delusion. Now Trump has as well. After the whole bullying in the Oval Office, then Zelensky ends up getting all of the things that he ultimately wanted. And I think it speaks to Trump's persona and the way he approaches these things. I think he believed, he thinks everything's like a freaking real estate negotiation. And that you can just get in a room and you can, get some rapport with the various players and figure out some kind of a deal that's going to work. And so he used his typical tactics of public bluster and, the theatrical display in the Oval Office. And when that didn't work, now it's just kind of a mess. It's hard to even say what the administration's position is. Remember the whole minerals deal? Whatever came of that, what does that even mean in all of this going forward? Is that even a real thing? Who knows? So, yeah, I think it's a real wild card what could come out of this, but I'm not particularly hopeful, just to set expectations, and I would love to be proven wrong. We'll see. But the other piece is that it is very difficult to end wars. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. We saw what happened with Biden, the pullout of Afghanistan. It's a very difficult political thing to do. And you really have to lay a lot of groundwork, narrative groundwork, for the public to understand why the stated position of the American government of both administrations of basically Ukraine's going to get everything and we're not going to give an inch, why you're going to end up with a result that is significantly different than that, why there are going to be so many concessions after all of the support that we've given Ukraine over the years. And there also hasn't really been any narrative built to prepare people for that eventuality. I think Trump is intelligent enough to know that there are many likely deals that could be done with Russia that would be pretty unpalatable to the American public.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a propagandistic thing, too, where you have to look at mass media. And this explains the Israel situation as well. If you watch Fox News, Churchill and Zelensky are of the same ilk, as there's no difference between them. The Ukrainians are freedom fighters. The Russians are committing genocide. I mean, I'm not joking. This is literally what they say over there. And the most politically palatable thing to do is to do exactly what we did with Afghanistan, which is just chunk as much money into the war for as long as humanly possible, slowly erode, and the mission continues to fail, but everybody just kind of moves on with their life because they don't want to deal with reality. And, that, by the way, includes many of the Ukrainians. Let's go ahead and put A7, please, up on the screen, because this is very important, and this is from very recently. Ukraine's support for its own war effort is collapsing. And this is very similar to the Afghan situation, where the people who actually have to do the fighting are like, yeah, I'm not so sure about this. Look, we'll take your money, that pays for a lot of nice condos in Dubai, but for the rest of it, I'm not so sure. So check this out. Ukraine's appetite for the war and support of a negotiated peace. Back in 2022, some 22% said that Ukraine should seek to negotiate an ending to the war as soon as possible, just 22%. Today, that is 69% of Ukrainians. This is the Gallup poll. And only 24% said, quote, Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins the war, whereas in 2022, it was some 73%. And that's because the reality of combat and also of what the war is setting in. 60-year-olds are now being allowed to join the Ukrainian war effort. 60-year-olds are now being, with no age limit whatsoever on the number of people in. Millions of the country have fled. The richest and most powerful Ukrainians are not fighting in this war. They're long gone. They're living, I saw them in the hotels in Budapest and in Vienna. They're living the high life, don't worry. And a lot of them still are actually printing money off of the corruption from the US money that continues to flow into the country. By the way, if you want to find out about that corruption, good luck to you. Let's go ahead and put A9, please, on the screen. Again, the Western media basically ignored it. There are a few stories here every once in a while, but Ukraine's, quote, new anti-corruption law led to the biggest protests in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Why? Because the parliament and Zelenskyy both approved legislation, quote, restoring the independence of the country's two main anti-corruption bodies. But in reality, what it did is that inside, Zelenskyy and others basically allowed the new laws to go into place where you had the anti-corruption watchdogs come under attack. They've reversed some of them, but the point is that it was seen as a widely authoritarian law to cover up much of the corruption for allegedly this democratic haven, in Europe, which, not only was the most corrupt country in all of Europe before the outbreak of the war, but Zelenskyy himself, of course, has canceled elections. He has huge opposition, actually, inside of the country. And worst of all, actually, is that if you did want some sort of end to the war, is that back in 2022, Ukraine passed a piece of legislation through its parliament basically saying that any, quote, negotiation or surrender or whatever has to be approved by referendum. But of course, the circumstances of the referendum are up to the government and, of course, in the wording in the way that it would all go out. So the government and all of them have plenty of tools available to them to nix any sort of deal. And then what can they say? They're like, oh, we tried, our people won't go for it. And then what's America going to do? Trump, at the end of the day, like you said, he's not going to cut them off. He just thinks it'll be politically unpalatable. It probably will be, to be honest. And so that leads to what? Just the continuation of the war. And, as if you're actually horrified by the violence and the killing, well, then you actually want to bring it to an end, and that will require something actually quite unpalatable. We could get there if media had reported it properly, and also if the government had had a consistent narrative from day one on Ukraine, but they haven't. They're all over the place.
They are all over the place. So we'll watch it closely, see, if there are any positive indications out of this, but, there's not a lot of groundwork that has been laid to create the likelihood of a positive outcome, is how I would put it.
Afghanistan was the same way. I mean, it's like it snuck up on everybody because nobody was paying attention. And everybody just assumed, they'll kick the can down the road and they're not actually going to do it. Biden finally was like, no, I'm not going to do it. We're out. And, we all saw how that worked. So it's not good. It's not good the way that this all works. And of course, that if Ukraine has to give up even one scrap of Eastern Ukraine, Fox News, CNN, and all these other people are going to be united and how this is the greatest travesty since Munich. And then what will that lead to? More boomer support and, of course, more pressure over at the White House from the guy who only watches Fox News to get his feeling on the pulse.
And who put way too many neocons in his administration also.
Bingo,
and who has no, ideological core himself and is very much buffeted by whoever is in his ear at that moment.
Absolutely. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.